Most welcome for this event on Europe's demographic outlook in the light of the digital transition. My name is Etienne Basso. I'm Director of the Members Research Service and actually also serving as Acting Director General for the EPRS. I would like to welcome our speakers. I would like to welcome our attenders online and all of you. This is the fifth time that the EPRS is presenting the demographic outlook. It's a flagship publication for the EPRS. And this time, while a lot of focus has been put on COVID and on the war, we are looking at a very particular aspect of demography, which is the link to digital transition. For that, we will have a discussion and 1.5 hours with presenters of the study and also experts. But before that, we have the privilege to have with us the first Vice President of the European Parliament, Othmar. Mr. Karas has been member of the European Parliament for Austria since 1999. He's member of the EPP group and is first Vice President of the institution since January this year and has several responsibilities, including information and communication policy, the Members' Research Service and the Library, both within the EPRS, relations with NATO, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. He is, of course, member of the Parliament's Bureau, but also on the Committee of Monetary Affairs and the delegation with the United States. Prior to his election, he was member of the Austrian Parliament and Secretary General of the Austrian People's Party. He is visiting lecturer at the Danube University in Krems and the Vienna University for Economics and Business and University of Vienna. He's also very committed to citizens' participation, citizens' democracy, demography are topics that are linked. So he's also founder and president of the Bürger Forum in Austria. So we are very much privileged to have you with us today, Vice President, and over to you to introduce the event. Thank you very much.
Very much, Etienne. Ladies and gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, dear panelists, dear members of the European Parliament, dear representatives of the EPRS, we are living in complicated times. Just when things started to improve after COVID, we woke up to the reality of Russia's war against Ukraine and people fleeing the conflict by thousands. We are now being confronted with rising prices and expect a winter when heat or eat may be daily consideration for many of us. But for all these everyday worries, we must not lose sight of the larger picture. We have seen heat waves, floods and hurricanes destroying crops and displacing populations, reminding us of the reality of climate change and of our weak efforts to prevent this from becoming a very uncomfortable future. While on the world stage we observe the ongoing struggle for influence between the United States and China, we look at Europe and see that it's getting old and its population is shrinking. But let me tell you, we have already identified these problems. These questions have become so important that for the first time we have a commissioner to ensure that demographic considerations become part of all EU policy making. In January 2021, the European Commission launched a debate on the challenges and opportunities of Europe's aging society. Within months, the European Parliament has joined this debate, observing that the old continent was growing older and calling for concrete steps to be taken. Months ago, the Commission put forward a European care strategy outlining what needs to be done to ensure affordable and accessible care services of high quality for all who may need them, young and old, today or in future. Furthermore, we have already agreed on a plan for a green and digital transition that also takes into account social aspects. Europe's recovery will only be possible based on these pillars. We know that is a bumpy road, but it is also opens up new possibilities. The digital transition is one of them. It has been with us for some time already. It is bound to stay, and we are starting to understand the challenges it brings. Therefore, I am glad to see that the European Parliamentary Research Service has dedicated this year's edition of the established Demographic Outlook series to the questions that the digital transition raises for the European population. And it is my pleasure to open today's debate with experts to hear what possible answers are there to the questions raised.
Thank you very much. Vice President, for setting the scene so effectively, and also for bringing this discussion around demography in a wider context of the political challenges Europe is facing. And you mentioned COVID, you mentioned the war, but you mentioned also the place of Europe in the continent, and also the challenge to move to more digital economies and more digital society, which is the topic that we are going to look at today. So I will now hand over the moderation of the event to Lasse Böhm. Lasse is the head of unit of the Economic Policies Unit, which is a unit that is looking at various issues, economy, science, and so on, but also the question of social affairs and demography. So he's going to moderate the discussion, then we will have the presentation of the study, reactions by the different experts, and then we will move to Q&A and open discussion with the public. Over to you, Lasse.
Thank you, Etienne, and a warm welcome to all our listeners and viewers, web streamed or on WebEx. And of course, welcome also to the Vice President. Thank you for your opener. We thought we would divide up this discussion into sort of two parts. The first part will be a presentation by Monika Kies, a policy analyst from the EPRS on the EPRS study. So she will present some of the key insights on which we will then base the discussion on in the second part. And the discussion itself will be subdivided, as it were, into two separate parts. The first one will be about digital and geographical divide. And in the second part, we will look into the future of the labor market. So it's a very broad topic, but we thought we would break it down a little bit into bite-sized chunks. And I can only encourage our listeners and viewers to come in with any questions you might have. If you would like to pose a question, please do use the chat function, which you find at the bottom right corner of the WebEx function. My name is Lasse Böhm. I have the pleasure of moderating today, and I'm happy to now give over the floor to Monika before introducing the other speakers. Monika has been with the EPRS for a couple of years now. She is our specialist on demography and on social policy, and currently also works on structural policy. But Monika, the floor is yours. You will be the first speaker with your presentation. Thanks, and over to you.
Thank you, Lasse, and good afternoon. So my name is Monika Kies, and I was the lead author of this year's demographic outlook. As already mentioned, this is part of a series, of an annual series, and this publication is about digital transformation and the impact of digital transformation on demography. So in my presentation, I will speak firstly about general demographic tendencies, and then in the second part about this thematic part, namely digital transformation and its impact on different demographic groups and regions. So let's go to the first slide, please. And the second one, please. So I will start with demographic tendencies in the EU. In this year's edition, this was a particular edition because there were tendencies we could identify that last for a long time already, but there were also some tendencies that were only characteristic for the past 2 years. But first, I will speak about these long-term tendencies in the EU. The population of the EU is a steadily shrinking proportion of the global population. If we compare figures from the 1960s, at that time, the population of the EU was 11.8% of the global population. When we compare this figure to the figure in 2021, we can see that it went down to 5.7%, which is a huge decrease. And according to prognosis, this will further go down to 3.7% at the end of the century. So this phenomenon can have huge economic impacts also. So this is a rather worrying tendency. Let's go to the next slide. One long-term tendency is, of course, also that the population of the EU is an aging population. If we compare population pyramids from 2001 and 2021, so we can see the difference in the different age bulges. Older age bulges are now broader than they were 20 years before. And this means this will have a direct impact on the labor market. So people in working age will be less and less, and they have to support an increasing group of people already out from the labor market or not yet on the labor market. So this will have also economic impacts, important economic impacts, and this leads also to an increasing median age in the EU, which is also a change that goes on already for a long time. But let's go to the next slide, because what is also characteristic for Europe's demography are dropping fertility rates. So here we can see the red line. This is the global fertility rate, which went down from at about 5 children per woman during a lifetime to 2.5. And the blue line is the EU fertility rate, which was already at 2.5 in the 60s, and it went down to 1.5. And this is also a worrying tendency because there is a replacement fertility rate. We call it replacement fertility rate because this is the level of fertility necessary to keep the population on long term, and this is at 2.1. And so we can see that the European population, the European fertility rate is below this. Let's go to the next slide, please. Here I would like to present a tendency which is relatively new. It is due to the COVID pandemic, to the impact of the COVID pandemic. Namely, there is a higher excess mortality and there is decrease in life expectancy. Excess mortality, this is represented here by this graph. This is this yellow line. It represents the percentage of additional deaths compared to a level before the pandemic. So we can see here peaks in this yellow line, and these peaks correspond to the COVID waves, to the waves of the COVID pandemic. And we can see that there were up to 30% more deaths during these peaks. And this has consequences, more long-term consequences, namely the decrease in life expectancy in the EU. If we compare figures from 2019 and 2021, we can see that in 2019, average EU life expectancy was at 81.3 years. And now it is at 80.1 years, so more than 1 year of decrease in life expectancy. And now I would like to move to the second part of my presentation with the next slide. So I will speak about the digital transformation and its impact on demography. So why we chose the digital transformation for this year's edition? It was because it is a very timely phenomenon. Digital transformation is already going on for decades, but it was further accelerated by the COVID pandemic and the related restrictive measures. So we know from our life experience, teleworking, then increasing use of online platforms or other digital services. So all these accelerated the digital transformation. And in this year's edition, we examined the impact of this digital transformation on different generations and also on regions. And concerning generations, we can see that there are big discrepancies in the use of digital tools between the different generations. For instance, here we can see internet use. The blue line is the youngest generation, those between 16 and 24. And we can see that this blue line increases rapidly. And the yellow line below is the oldest generation, those between 54 and 74. And we can see the discrepancy, which is growing. Let's come to the next slide, because there is not only a difference in the use of digital tools, but there is also a difference in the ability to use these digital tools, namely the digital literacy. Here in this table, we have a comparison of the different age groups and the percentage of those who have at least basic digital skills. And here we can also see a huge discrepancy between the youngest ones, where 71% has at least basic digital skills, and those in retirement age, where this is only 25%. So this is also a big difference. And there are also other differences between generations, for instance, for which purpose these age groups use the digital and what problems they encounter. And let's come now to the demographic part. Next slide, please. Because there is not only a digital divide between generations and social groups, but there is also a digital divide between different regions of Europe. There is, on this map, we can see it very clearly, a north-south divide. So in the northern parts of Europe, in red, internet use is much more frequent than in the southern parts, indicated in blue. And there is also, maybe to a lesser extent, but a west-east discrepancy from the point of view of use of digital tools and also availability of digital tools. And let's go to the next slide, please. Because at regional level, there are not only differences between regions and member states, but also differences between rural and urban areas. Here we can see it on the broadband connectivity. So the blue line is are the urban areas where broadband connectivity is at 70%, and the yellow line are the rural areas at 40%. So we can clearly see this difference, this growing difference between urban and rural areas, not only in connectivity, but also concerning other aspects. And now I would like to close my presentation with an additional remark, because regional, social, and generational differences in availability and use of digital technologies, these differences can also go together and they can add up. So if member states or the EU would like to tackle the digital divide, this requires an approach that takes into account all these different aspects of the digital divide. And I would like to thank you for your attention, and I will hand over to Lasse, please.
Thank you, Monica, for this presentation, which gave the perfect overview and start to the discussion we will hopefully have by pointing to the different divides that we have. Regional, generational, but also the urban-rural divide. And in fact, it's with the urban and rural divide that I would like to start this discussion. But before I do so, let me introduce the four excellent speakers that we have. It's my great pleasure to present to you Daniela Vono de Villena, who is Deputy Executive Secretary of Population Europe. Daniela is based in Berlin. A warm welcome to you, Daniela. Population Europe is a network of 36 demographic institutes across Europe, and I know that you have years of work experience working on demographic issues. And you've previously a researcher at the EUI and a range of universities across Europe. So a warm welcome to you, Daniela. Our second speaker will be Fabrizio Natale, who is a project manager for demography, migration, and governance at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. And he focuses his work on migration drivers, territorial demography, and the relationship between climate change and demography. Interesting aspects. So I'm very curious to hear your views about these different divides, and maybe there are more divides, so feel free to bring these in the discussion. Welcome, Fabrizio. Our third outside expert, a pleasure to have you, José Enrique Garcilazo from the OECD. He's waving there. Hello. Hello, José Enrique. You're the head of the Regional and Rural Unit and deputy head of the Division on Regional Development and Multi-Level Governance in the Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities in the OECD. So that's a long title, but it gives us a glimpse of your various specializations, which include various economic aspects, I should say, including in particular SMEs. When we talk about demography, and I know that you are also concerned with the issue of rural prosperity, development, growth, and well-being. So those are the three outside speakers, and we have a fourth speaker, a colleague from inside EPRS. It's my great pleasure to welcome Mar Negrero, who is a policy analyst in the Digital Policies Unit and worked alongside Monica on these issues. Mar will most likely speak about digital issues across the board, because we can already see this is obviously not a coincidence that this theme was chosen, digital policy was chosen as a theme for this study, because we have already seen in the presentation some of the profound effects of digitalization, and I'm curious to hear from our various speakers what they think about it. A warm welcome to you. As I said, the audience, you're free to put any questions you might have into the chat. I will then take over your questions and put them to the panel. But I suggest we go in the order of Daniela first, followed by Fabrizio, then Enrique and Mar Negrero. And maybe we start off with the last divide, the last of the several divides, which Monica outlined in her presentation, which was the rural and urban divide. I mean, one of the slides that you showed, Monica, which stuck to my mind, was the still huge divide between rural regions and cities when it comes to ultra-fast broadband. It's of course only one of the variables and indicators, but I think it's a very graphic divide because if I'm not mistaken, there is a gap of 30% in connectivity. So rural areas connected to the tune of 40% and cities have an average connectivity rate of 70%. So that's a huge gap despite policymakers speaking for decades about the need to connect rural areas. And so my first question would be to Daniela. Given these developments, that big cities are one step ahead in the process of digital transformation, leaving regions and small cities behind. And do you, from your perspective, see any evidence that this is about to change? Maybe with people moving or the pandemic having had different effects. Daniela, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lasse. And first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation to join this excellent panel. I'm super excited, and also to congratulate Monica Kish on the great report. Answer to your question. Yes, in many cases, the trend can be reversed, and it depends a lot on political interest and resources, of course, but also on understanding demographic and societal trends and acting accordingly. And this is my expertise, so I would like to talk a bit more about that. So one of the obvious issues here is that a big fraction of the public resources is distributed to regions and cities depending on the number of inhabitants. Strong internet access is, of course, fundamental, as Monica already showed us, and many regions across Europe are not there yet, and this should definitely be a priority. But let me focus on societal and demographic aspects. When we look at societal trends and the process of digitalization, one of the first aspects to come to my mind is the role of flexible working arrangements potentially helping smaller cities to flourish. We have seen during and after the pandemic, as you mentioned, Lasse, individuals using this flexibility to leave big cities, and lots of hope and excitement lie in this trend. But the pattern so far seems to be mostly to move to nearby regions, leaving the most remote and rural areas that are really in trouble untouched, or with little change in their population structure so far. It doesn't mean that the trend is not there, but so far we have seen little impact. One of the reasons for that is the stage of individual's life course that needs to be part of this conversation. For example, if you have children, telework alone won't be the only element to think about when deciding to move to less populated regions. If you have to take care of your parents, it's the same. You may not want to move from where you are. I'm really happy that Fabrizio is here with us today because I'm a big fan of his GRC report, The Demographic Landscape of EU Territories, and I hope you'll learn more about it today. But in this report, he and his co-authors shows that they add more elements on the life course patterns that are super interesting. For example, by showing that younger people who tend to be the age group with more digital skills are actually those at a higher risk of leaving rural areas, while the 60 plus are those reporting higher propensity to move to rural areas. So policies really need to take these patterns into account and play an active role in attracting newcomers, while also staying attractive for those who are already there. Population structure and its dynamic matters a lot and should be part of this conversation. So I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniela. You just cited Fabrizio, so all I need to do is to hand over the microphone to him. Fabrizio, how do you see this? How do you see this development? If I understood Daniela correctly, Daniela, you started off on a positive mood, saying it can be changed, but it has to be changed by political decisions. So would you agree to that, and would you subscribe to the same analysis? Fabrizio, the floor is yours.
Yes, just let me help my speech with a slide. Okay, so indeed, what you were saying, Daniela, is our starting point for the work on demography in this unit was on the territorial aspects, and we have started to do this in relation to the request by Vice President Suiza. and in support of the Green Paper on Aging and long-term vision for rural areas. So one of our first initiatives on demography was on territorial aspects. And the starting point was that within a generalized aging process in the EU, we can see that territories are aging at different speed and depopulating at different speed. And rural-urban dimension is indeed one of these components driving these different trends. But besides the rural-urban classification, there is also a more refined classification that we can use to study demographic trends, and this is the distance from city centers. And this is also linked to the digital connectivity and how digital connectivity is spread across EU territories. So in this slide, I show on the left side the traveling time to closest city center in minutes on the x-axis, and connectivity. And this is the median values across all EU municipalities. And you see that places which are close to city centers have better connectivity, and then the connectivity starts to go down when we move outside from city centers. At 2 hours of city centers, the connectivity is really at the lowest level. And there is also a change in time from 2019 to 2021. There was an improvement, but this improvement is happening in cities and not in places which are far from cities. So this is already telling that the digital divide, depending on place and distance from city center, is not shrinking. The digital connectivity in places far from city center is not shrinking. On the right side, you see how the share of population by age is distributed across traveling time from city center in the upper part and in the lower part in respect of digital connectivity. And we can see this by 2 age groups. So the age group 1929, the young people have higher shares in cities, and then the shares tend to go down when we move outside from the cities. And the opposite is happening for the elder. In the lower part, you see the relation with digital connectivity. The younger age group are overrepresented in areas with good connectivity, and the elderly are overrepresented in areas with poor digital connectivity. This is telling that what was seen through the COVID, the hope that teleworking and movement outside of cities could help to contrast the trends in the aging and the population, needs, in order to materialize, needs to be grounded on closing this gap in digital connectivity that we have in places far from city center. I hope I gave you a flavor of this digital and geographical divides and how this relates to demographic aspects.
Thank you, Fabrizio. Well, I take up your slide and put it straight to Enrique. A fascinating slide, the correlation between the speed of the connectivity and the distance from the city center. Enrique, what's your viewpoint on how important are digital solutions? Will they really reverse this trend? And if so, which digital solutions to adopt and how to make sure that they are getting adopted across the board?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm also very pleased to be here today and have this fascinating discussion. I think it's really the right sets of questions at the right panel. So from my perspective, I think the first question that we need to ask ourselves is, do we want to change is this the objective of policy, to change the gaps? And I know this might sound a bit controversial, but I will try to elaborate a little bit more. When we look at the demographic trends across the OECD countries, we do find that indeed all countries are aging. It's not just a rural phenomenon, but we see that approximately in some countries, for example, in Japan or Korea, it's just something that population, as we've seen, fertility rates are decreasing, but people are just living longer. And I think that's that usually the terminology of aging tends to have a negative connotation. And on our side, we work a lot on strategies to try to make the best out of aging and longevity. With this in mind, if we look at indeed the patterns inside countries, we do find that urbanization is a process that is happening across all OECD countries. In fact, just one country had a lower share of urban people in the last 20 years, that's Greece. And then the patterns of population decline are more pronounced in rural areas. I think we also find that particularly in those that are remotely and close to medium and smaller cities. Then we haven't talked much about aging. You know, the differences in aging dependency ratios are about 3 percentage points when we look at metro and non-metro. But what's interesting is that even in small metro, you have similar aging patterns than in remote and rural metros. It's really about larger cities versus the other types of cities in terms of the aging. I think when we think about the digital transformation, we've done tremendous advancements in terms of coverage. I think the gaps in coverage between urban and rural have decreased. I think nowadays there are about 84% of households has coverage to broadband, and 87%. Yet the biggest gaps come indeed, as we have seen before, on the quality, on high-speed connections. And we've done our own research ourselves, and we do find similar type of gaps. We managed to get a hold to data on Ookla that measures the high-speed connections, and we do find that, for example, cities across the G20 are about 20 percentage points higher, and rural are about 32 percentage points lower in terms of the speed of connections. If you look at digital skills, we also find that there's a big divide between urban and rural. And something that is quite interesting, we looked at the gaps between PISA scores. And here the gaps are big between urban and rural, but the gaps go down as you take into account the socioeconomic characteristics. Now, if you think about what remote working brings, it brings a lot of possibilities and potential. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, the rates of remote working have tripled in cities, and in rural, they have only increased about 70%. Yes, there's been an increase in remote working in rural, but the gains are even bigger in cities. And I think this is something very typical of the digital divide, that through technology and digital skills, you're going to have winners and losers. And the way that we see it is that some rural regions are going to really benefit, but others will not. And I don't think that the patterns will be reverted across the entire average, but there will be pockets of opportunity in some rural places. And this is where I think it's quite interesting to think about how to maximize these opportunities. On our side, we also think that we need to not try to use policies to revert some of these trends, because after all, young people or mobile people are living to cities because there are better jobs, there's more amenities, and there's nothing wrong with that. The question is, how can you attract them back at some stage? How can you make the most out of situations where you're facing demographic decline? And we're starting to work on this concept of smart shrinking. And here's where I think the biggest possibilities are for some of these remote places, because in fact, if you are remote, you're far away from markets, you are, it's more costly to deliver goods and services. So I think the digital solution can overcome some of these challenges. So the question is how to transform in a way that you can better utilize some of those resources and assets. And I'll just give it back to you just to give enough time for the panel.
Thanks, Enrique. You threw up a multitude of questions there, and I was especially intrigued by by the first statement you put out there, is which, if I can cite you correctly, but please do correct me if not, is it our policy aim to change the gaps? So thanks for playing a little bit devil's advocate, but then you came down, if I may say, a little bit on the realist side, saying there will be a more nuanced picture. There will be islands almost of opportunity, if I understood you correctly. I just encourage all participants, all panelists, to come in on these. I think that's a fascinating question. Is it our policy aim to change the gaps? And maybe can I add, as the head of the economic policy unit, at what cost, of course? Because money, of course, is scarce, especially against the backdrop of the war and the other transformations that we're faced with. But before we go deeper into these questions, finally, I'm pleased to give the floor to Mar Negrero. We stick for the moment to the question of digital. Mar, in your point of view, is the digital transformation still ongoing and is it still accelerating? Floor is yours.
Thank you, Lasse, and thank you to all the speakers. Already, indeed, very interesting points. It's difficult to predict what the future is bringing us, you know, we don't have a crystal ball, and a lot of things have happened in the last years which were really unforeseen. But, well, what we know when we ask the European citizens, and there was a Eurobarometer survey last year, asking them about the role that the digital technologies will have in their lives in 2030, it is increasingly important for them because more than 80% said that they expect them to have a very important role or an important role. And they're not naive, you know, they see advantages, they see disadvantages. About 1/3 already admit that sometimes they have problems disconnecting and balancing the online and the offline world. Especially when you look at the younger demographic group, youngsters, more than 50% said in this survey that they have problems disconnecting. And in fact, if you think about the pandemic, they were one of the groups that were spending more time online with the remote schooling, connecting with their peers in social networks and communicating a lot online, and they remain very intense users. So in that case, I think that digital technologies definitely remain very important. And more than half of the companies, according to the European Investment Bank survey, invested in digital throughout the pandemic. Those that had already invested before were able to do better. Digital firms did better than those which were starting from scratch. And also in the EU, we did a bit less investments than they did in the US at the time. And to really get to the digital transformation by 2030, as the Commission is planning to, we need to invest more. There is a record amount of funding right now with the recovery and resilience facilities. We are targeting 20% of the investments to go to digital transition, to digital priorities. And according to the Commission assessments, in the national plans, there is already like 26%, so we have surpassed that. Now this needs to be realized. And in this European Investment Bank survey I was talking about, actually they say that more complex digitalization processes have been put on hold. So we have to see whether this is really going to happen or not, given the economic crisis. And the Commission, in the meantime, 1 year after the beginning of the pandemic, in March 2021, put forward a new digital strategy, much more focused, Enrique, on focusing on closing gaps, actually, and targets that we want to achieve by 2030 to really reach this digital transformation. They're looking at the improvement in the infrastructure, and well, as we were saying before, the geographical aspects are important. We have improved a lot. The digital divide, the OECD was already describing it in 2001, you know, and in 2014 in Europe, we got the broadband for all target, thanks to the satellite and a mixture of technologies. Now we are looking into gigabyte speeds. And to achieve that in all users, business and companies and households is going to be a very big target, very challenging, especially when considering rural areas. They're also looking into human capital, improving the digital skills. The target is to have 80% of the EU population with basic digital skills. And right now, as Monica was saying, we have about 57%. So there is, and some countries are actually lower than that. So it's going to be a challenging objective. We also need to get more SMEs online with 90% is the target. Right now we have about 60% with low intensity use. There is also some targets to improve public services online. This digital decade strategy is very timely. Right now, actually, there was an interinstitutional agreement between Parliament and Council. So it was in July and it will be voted in November. And it's going to put a policy program in place from next year that is going to measure progress towards these targets and the race of investment towards these targets as well.
Thank you, Mar. Well, I think you touched on the right question, because I think it's time to talk about digital skills, as you alluded to. And could I maybe ask the question to Fabrizio, unless anyone else has a question to come in, then please feel free to do so. Fabrizio, in your point of view, how much of a brain drain is going on? How much of a brain drain do we see in the European labor market? And in particular, maybe, what's your view on the geographical digital divide that we see in Europe? You might remember the slides that Monica showed at the beginning, the red and the blue color on the map of Europe. And we saw digital skills in the labor market. So the number of people who regularly work with IT equipment and are very skilled at using it, the number of people being much higher, especially in the north of Europe. And Monica also pointed to a slightly more subdued east-west divide. Fabrizio, I would be intrigued to hear your view on this.
Yes, indeed. There is an east-west divide and also south-north divide, and there are young people moving in these directions. But the point is this negative? And as I will try to elaborate probably in the next round, is this permanent? I think this is a critical question we need to answer. So people are migrating to increase their human capital, and at some point they are coming back and bringing this human capital and the enrichment from their migration experience back to their countries and to their regions. Sometimes the flows are not compensating. So the volume of young people moving from east to west is not compensated by equal returns. But we have to also see the composition of these flows, and we have to see what is the effect of those that are coming back in the economic developments of their countries and their regions after the enrichment in human capital from the migration experience. So I hope I have answered on this, but I will elaborate more on this point probably in the next round.
Well, maybe a question to Daniela. I was going to ask you about adult learning, but can I come back to what Fabrizio just said? And Fabrizio, perhaps inadvertently, also played a little bit devil's advocate by posing the question, is this negative? What's your point of view on these migratory waves within Europe's labor market?
Exactly, I completely agree. I completely agree with Fabrizio, and it's very interesting because it was a similar excitement with teleworking when the pandemic happened, and there was an important flow of people coming back to, for example, to Bulgaria, to Serbia, to Bosnia, and at that time there has been quite a lot of online events to discuss like this big return. And at the end, what has been seen is that it was much more about circular migration than a permanent return. And I think what we have to always celebrate as being Europe is that there's freedom of movement, and people is free to do whatever they like in terms of where they live. And this is something that we should always celebrate and never cut back. The challenge is, if you want to retain your population, you should not blame Central European countries. You should work to retain countries. And I think this blaming policy that has been going on for quite a while, it's time to rethink about it and really take ownership on the right policies.
So the picture is much more nuanced. You're saying. If you allow me a comment, I always find it fascinating to talk about intra-European migratory movements when discussing it from an economic perspective as opposed to a demographic perspective, because of course from an economic perspective that's exactly what you want. You want the perfect allocation of labor and capital within the single market, and in fact one of the weaknesses which we saw in the Euro crisis, which hopefully is behind us, was that there wasn't enough movement to balance out inequalities, but from a purely economic perspective. This was clearly not the perspective taken by people who are worried either about the local impact of a brain drain and the question of how permanent it will be, as well as about the wider geographical, the demographic question. But Daniela, if I may stick with you for a moment, what about adult learning? I know you've invested a lot of research into this. How important is adult learning, and what can Europe do in this field?
Thank you for this question. This is a very nice topic. I really like to talk about this, and this is based on work I have done in the framework of the project EduLife, led by Professor Hans-Peter Blosfeld, and also with amazing co-authors. So it's not only about my work. So yes, adult learning can substantially improve careers, and it's more efficient than replacing workers due to the lack of concrete skills. So it certainly contributes to developing digital skills of older generations. And yes, it could help to close the gap on the labor market caused by demographic changes. At this EduLife project, we looked at specific aspects by analyzing cross-national surveys and also longitudinal surveys in Europe that included questions on adult learning. And the concrete impact depends a lot on the type of adult learning you look at, and also the concrete outcomes that we were interested in. And it was very complex. But I can give you some examples of what we have found. So among our results, we found, for instance, little impact of adult learning on securing a permanent contract. But upgrading helps individuals with unstable careers to move into full-time jobs with wages above the working poor level. It also helps people move from unemployment to non-precarious employment. From the non-formal learning, our results are much more heterogeneous depending on countries and the outcome, but overall a positive impact was often there as well. What are the main issues in this story of adult learning? So the first is that participation rates are still low in Europe. The second is the fact that those who are already well educated are the ones who tend to get more education in comparison to the poorly educated. There's also the fact that occupations that the highly educated tend to work in are likely to require more training than the low-skilled jobs. So adult learning is not necessarily bringing more equality to societies. Actually, we found that no country among those that we studied were able to reduce social inequalities through adult learning. The second element are the barriers to access adult learning. While some countries still have lots of barriers for potential adult learners to access education institutions and pursue formal education, in others, the main issue is that adult learning mainly happens at work as employer-sponsored training, like, for example, in Italy. So opportunities are mostly for employed individuals. So everything that I have said leads to the conclusion that if we want to increase participation among the most disadvantaged and truly use adult learning as a way to close gaps in the labor market, which I think it's a wonderful idea, we need more target policies to promote participation, particularly among those who are not intrinsically motivated, as it seems this won't happen naturally. So we truly need policies to increase participation in adult learning. Thank you.
Can I ask a follow-up question there? Because
of course,
I thought it's very interesting that you said on the one hand, participation rates are still very low, and on the other hand, adult learning, if I may paraphrase you, it's not a silver bullet. In fact, it might, in some cases, actually increase the gap between the highly educated, who become even more highly educated, and those not having previously enjoyed a high level of at least secondary or higher education, presumably, and who might remain at this level. Is there a role for the EU to play? I mean, it's a very contentious field, and I'm sort of veering slightly off topic here, but I think I would just be curious to hear your views. Social policy is, of course, by and large, a national competence, and educational policy for sure is a national competence. But what role for the EU besides giving money? Do we need to start this discussion at EU level from your perspective, or do we just leave this at national level?
Yes, it's a good question for which I don't have an answer. But it's a good contemplation to think about, because of course, educational policies are country specific, and each country has a multiplicity of different education system at the national level. So it's not only that countries are different. regions are different and the responsibilities are divided depending on the country different ways. So what can the EU do in this field? I think certainly something that would be very important is to raise awareness, which I think DG skills for DG education, like on the work they are doing on skills, it's the colleagues are pushing a lot awareness on the importance of adult learning. And this is very necessary, but we should also think a lot about labor market structures and the way companies, and not only education systems, but also companies are promoting adult learning, and also what you're doing with those who are outside the labor market and who really need to jump in. The value of certificates, what's the importance that different actors gives to certificates. We never talk about certificates at EU level. And for example, we had a discussion some months ago about attracting talents to Europe, and for economists who were joining our panel, the recognition of certificates was something very, like the highest importance, and this has barely been talked at the EU spheres for right reasons, because it's not the competence, but there are things that should be there. I mean, just some insights. I don't have the answer.
Well, I don't think there is an easy answer, but let's go indeed to the economy and the labor market, with maybe a question to Enrique, how you see the impact of the digital transformation on the labor market, and also on productivity, and does this also increase the gap? We spoke a lot about the digital divide in some cases, well, in the case of adult learning, actually widening. Enrique.
Yeah, very good question, but maybe I'll just go back to your first remark to clarify.
Yes, please. Yeah.
And it relates to a little what you mentioned from the economics perspective. What I'm trying to get is that sometimes divides on demographic patterns doesn't necessarily mean there should be sounds of alarm. I do think that if we look at the past lessons, policy is not very good at inducing people to move from one place to another with automatic mechanisms. And we do find that still many countries, this notion, oh, let's repopulate this place or this area, when in fact an industry has disappeared, a natural resource. I just don't think that from the perspective of a good use of public resources, that should be the priority. That said, I think the key notion here is the well-being, the standards. Once you have gaps in well-being, then I think there's a different rationale for that. So what I'm trying to say is let's be more smarter with the policy objective, and that gets me to your question on the future of digital to some of these lagging places. I do think that one of the biggest challenges of those that are losing productivity is indeed how to attract skilled people, how to attract the youth. So there's a lot of effort on thinking about making places attractive, transforming jobs. And here I think there's a huge potential, and digital is at the core of it. You mentioned before the SMEs. If you don't have broadband and kind of like good connections to markets, you cannot compete. I do think that the digital divide is a key element. That is, if you don't invest in good digital infrastructure, you're putting places at a disadvantage to attract firms, to attract talent. Here we wrote a paper some years ago for the G20 in Italy, trying to make the argument that you cannot use complete market-based solutions to close the digital divide, because there's no incentives for operators and markets to invest digital infrastructure in rural. So we need to think about other solutions, such as demand aggregation models, even local initiatives to improve the digital, to put them at an equal footing. Second to that, I do think that how to transform some of the primary sectors is a very interesting area. We have an initiative that's about mining, places that are specialized in mining and extractive activities. And you would think that mining is an old kind of like activity, and you do find that in many places they're transforming it. They're making new jobs that are attractive for the youth, that are very digital. They're trying to clean mining. So that also means you need a lot of technology and people with expertise. And these are the types of new jobs that I think could be transforming some of the industries. And the same is true with agriculture or some of the more primary activities to make them more attractive. The other place that I think it should be quite interesting is the opportunities of remote working that I mentioned previously. Although I don't think that that's going to close the average gap, I do think that some places can extremely benefit from all of a sudden being attractive locations to bring high skill into the labor market. And just because there's more amenities, housing is prices are lower. These are attractive places where if you combine sort of like working twice or three times a week there with migration to the city, that can be like really interesting places to sort of like attract population and high skills. And I think here is how can policy help leverage on some of these trends or some like the green patterns that I was mentioning before. I think that's where it's quite interesting to think about it. So I think I'll give it back to you now.
Thank you. Well, you mentioned the word attractiveness in terms of Standortpolitik, if I may use the German expression. So the attractiveness of a particular location to attract workers. But of course, there are some locations which find it increasingly difficult, if not impossible, to attract enough workers. And there are gaps in certain places in Europe, in certain parts of our labor market. Gaps which might still increase if you look at the digital divide, but also the age pyramid, which is no longer a pyramid, which Monica showed us in one of her first slides. So maybe just a follow-up question from what Enrique just said, a follow-up question to Mar, in how far digital transformation can help close some of these gaps, meaning a shortage of workers in the labor market. Of course, referring to questions like the use of artificial intelligence or robotization or automation in the sort of widest possible sense. Is this a tool to close labor market shortages or to address labor market shortages without creating dangers elsewhere?
Well, thank you. It's a tough question. I think before the pandemic, there were quite a few studies, basically raising some kind of popular fears that artificial intelligence or robots might replace us and we might go to a jobless society. And with the pandemic acceleration in digital transformation, this has been in a way also being fed. In the demographic outlook publication, we go in a chapter actually written by Monica more in depth into all these things. I think that there is basically, of course, a certain type of tasks that might get replaced eventually by robots or by artificial intelligence, and those that could apply more recoding or more repetitive type of manual tasks. There is a very good CDFOP study that was published recently looking into that and concluding that actually we shouldn't be fearing that the robots or artificial intelligence are going to be replacing us, that on the contrary, we need to invest in digitalization and that upskilling, as we were saying before, is a very important component and that workers in digital firms need to be also bringing a wide range of different type of tasks. Connecting to the digital skills issue we said before, the digital skills gap is also something that's been there. Like the digital divide, we are talking about it for more than 20 years. The type of skills needs are changing with the digital transition now. The European Commission in the digital decade targets I was talking about has put a target to have at least 20 million ICT specialists by 2030 if we really want to achieve the digital transformation and to convince companies to invest in digital, because like 70% of companies in a survey have said that one of the reasons why they're not investing more in digital is because of the lack of digital professionals. So right now we have about 9 million, so it's more than doubling this amount. And of course, a lot of young people or people in the current workforce could be upskilling themselves to be able to reach this transformation by 2030.
as a sort of follow-on question, but are we then not hitting the same problem which Daniela alluded to earlier, that upskilling in terms of adult learning is well and fine, but only for sections of the labor market and society, namely those people who are already highly skilled? Or to put it differently, maybe we can also sort of look at this from a generational perspective more. What does this mean for different generations? What does this mean for the older generation? How would you upskill the sort of 50 plus workers who might have been so far not very conducive to using IT methods and well, generally changing career course for that matter?
Well, it's obviously a very challenging task to do. You know, the European, there's a recommendation from the Council on key competence of lifelong learning to apply throughout your life, and digital competence has been there since the year 2006. They keep on updating it. The latest update in 2018 considers different dimensions, because it's not only about using regularly the internet. You can see when looking at the internet activities in Eurostat that older people are increasingly doing things online. During the confinement, a lot of old people ended up doing their first video calls for the first time, or teleworking. And definitely there has been an improvement, but there are other aspects and other dimensions that are being addressed. And I will maybe invite everybody, actually, there is the Digital Competence Framework simulation tool to test and you can go online and test yourself, your digital competence, and see which level you get, because it's not only about using the internet, manipulating data, or creating content. It's about also critical thinking. It's about safety issues. There are many components, and well, there are different things that the Commission has been doing. There is a job coalition which is launching things. A lot of work also done by the Age Network, when we talk more about elder people and retired people trying to increase their digital literacy skills. But yes, it's a challenging issue, but it's definitely something that we need to address in the EU, because we have a big gap. Only in cybersecurity, there are 350,000 professionals lacking right now. So there is a certain type of, as I said, in this CDFOP study, they come like guessing 7 out of 10 professions or roles that might get replaced in the future by automation. So it is something that, depending on your skill levels and your profession, you might need to tackle in a different manner. It's a complex question.
Well, Daniela, maybe, what's your perspective on this indeed very complex question? So thanks, Mar, for elaborating on this. But Daniela, in your research and in your experience, I mean, do you have some facts and figures or some pointers as to whether the older generation became more mobile, in the sense of more agile, using digital tools and becoming engaged with IT tools and also acquiring the necessary skills? And has this then translated into higher uptakes of jobs and job changes, specifically for the older generation?
Well, I don't have the latest figures about this, but this is definitely a trend that we are living longer and we're living healthier for a longer time than before. And of course, people will stay more active and participate in the labor market for longer. This is definitely a trend, yes.
If you allow, I will rephrase this question. We'll still sort of with the same topic, because I think this is one of the key things that we need to tackle when we talk about the fact that our societies do become older. What do we do with the older generation, and how do we get the older generation to remain or re-enter the labor market, given these various constraints that we've identified? I mean, if you add to the generational dimension the distance from the urban centers, so we're doing a slight circle back to what we discussed at the beginning. And if you allow, maybe I put this question to Enrique: how do you see the situation of the older generation, especially in relation to the distance to large urban centers, which are thriving, of course, on the digital transformation? I mean, distance to the frontier, does this matter? Does distance still matter?
It's a very good question indeed, and I think it's a fascinating discussion. I'm just also happy to be part of it. I think this is it's a very important question. Just to give you some figures, some years ago we did a report in Japan, and in Japan the age of the average farmer is 67 years old. The life expectancy is around 92, 93 years old. So how to, I wouldn't focus that much in terms of re-entering the labor market, but reactivating this generation and this sort of cohort is a huge policy initiative that I think we don't have enough knowledge on how to do it effectively. I mean, that would be my first response. I think more work needs to be done. We've heard certainly of stories that are very inspiring, where some communities were able to connect to the internet, and all of a sudden there was a small town in Japan. They had advertised some sort of a traditional product and became like the booming sensation there. So there are stories of ways you can go around it. But also we learn from some centers, for example, in Finland, where you do this reactivation by creation a bit more social centers, ways of how you can bring in some of these elderlies and also play a role as mentoring with the youth. I think, thinking about centers that can play multiple roles to reactivate, that's going to help on the health, that's going to help on psychological, on breaking some of these isolations that are very typical in remote places. So for me, this is an area that I think that we should also think a lot. I also think that thinking about the elderly, not just in terms of reactivation, but we have a huge cohort that the baby boomers that are very wealthy. So there's a lot of thinking about the silver economy with new industry. They're all locating in usually warm places. That's also another interesting element of how can you also take a person that is retired, that has had a very successful business career, how can you really pass on some of that knowledge to other cohorts within the community? So I think it's also a very interesting element to think about how to reactivate them in different ways, whether these are formal programs or more voluntary initiatives. I think they can be quite successful. In terms of the frontier, something just to share, we did our economics department did a study some years ago, because the question of declining productivity has become sort of like an OECD phenomenon. You have kind of a productivity increase by this famous 2% percentage points in the Second World War up until the late 80s, and since then it has started to decline. So there was a big question of are firms losing the productivity? So they did a large-scale micro problem, and it showed that your frontier firms are not declining in productivity. They are increasing tremendously, but it's the rest. It's all of the rest firms, and I think this is something valuable for us to also translate that in terms of geography and space. Many cities are doing quite well, and it's not a problem of an overall average, but the question is, how can you disseminate that? How can you spill over? How can you better connect some of those advancements into cohorts, but also places that are maybe a bit more remote? So I just wanted to also connect to your last question and put that thought back to you.
Well, does this, to take up your argument, but does this then mean that we are not learning enough? I mean, we're talking about adult learning, but let's talk about EU institutional learning. Does this mean we're not doing enough from a coordinated European side? And we spoke a little bit about competences, but let's leave the treaty question, competences aside for the moment, be it on a communautaire base or intergovernmental, but is the EU not doing enough to learn from other regions? Just an open question maybe to the entire panel. I'm not sure whether some of you might wish to come in on this. Learning from the best in town, so to speak, but on a global scale, that seemed to be your argument. And you specifically cited Japan, which is of course a much older society, or at least was struggling with low growth and high age levels for the better part of the last decade.
I can come in if you want.
Yeah, well, no one else seems to want to come in on this one, so please feel free. Yes.
Well, I do think that you can never learn enough. So I think that that's also part of the role of the OECD to better connect some of our member countries that are non-European to European. Just the case of Japan, I think they're much more advanced on thinking about how to deal with demographic decline, just because the pressures are so much bigger. But it doesn't mean that in the past they haven't changed a sort of paradigm. That was in the past, it was sort of a taboo to bring this issue of we are losing population and we're all aging. You know, it was kind of like hidden under the rug, and there was a big change on the way they've approached it, to the extent that they created this long-term vision where they think themselves in 60, 70 years how the demographic settlements will be and what investments they need to do nowadays to put themselves into that sort of position. So in terms of building roads, sort of like centering some of the services. So I think, you know, that having that long-term vision is certainly something that we're seeing in the EU. This long-term vision for rural, this rural long-term vision is heading into that direction, which I think is quite nice. The case of Korea is also quite interesting. They created this new digital deal. And if you look at these digital divides, Korea is by far the one with the lowest digital divide. So I think there's also very interesting lessons to be learned from Korea themselves. But that said, I do think that the European model puts to the table some also very, very interesting lessons for other countries outside. And just coming back to the question around cohesion, I think that's for us, how to address cohesion. How do you think about cohesion beyond the national model, but also thinking at the subnational dimension, and this notion of creating these zones where you have free mobility of people and firms. So I think there's a lot of also lessons from the European model that are not just, it doesn't just work the other way around. So just to open your question to bring in some comments.
Thanks. I would love to continue this discussion, but I think we're slowly running out of time. We have about 5 to 10 minutes max left because people have meetings at 3 p.m. We normally try to finish these meetings here in time. But I wouldn't want to close without asking a question to Fabrizio in particular, but maybe also Monica if she wishes to come in, because of course we can't have a talk about demography and not talk about what happened in the last 2 years. COVID, but also more recently the impact of the Ukraine situation. So can we just sort of zoom out again, go back from the sort of long-term trends which we tackled in the previous discussion? And I'm just curious to hear Fabrizio's views on the most recent developments relating to the pandemic and the very recent developments and how this shows in demographic trends in Europe. Fabrizio.
Yes. Ukraine is clearly another shock that we have experienced in just 2 years. So we had COVID, Brexit, and Ukraine. And this is a shock, particularly for Ukraine. The demography of Ukraine was declining already before the war. It was due to high mortality, low fertility, and high immigration, especially to Poland. And now we have experienced a mass exodus from Ukraine of refugees. And all the scenarios that we are starting to put in our projections about what could happen after the war are indicating that the decline of the population in Ukraine will be dramatic. Some of compensation from this decline could emerge from the different assumptions we put on the scenarios for migration, and especially in the migration with the EU. How permeable and how circular the migration will remain between the EU and Ukraine will mostly dictate the differences in demographic future of the country. And this brings me back to the story of brain drain and temporary migration, which I started to introduce at the beginning. We normally think of migration as something that which is static. So we let people move from the country and we consider them in the destination countries for the life course. In fact, migration is highly fluid. And most of the people are coming back, 50% of the people are coming back within 10 years from the migration decision. And this will be applicable also to Ukraine. So the scenarios about the future of Ukraine will depend on what are the return rates of the refugees but also the return rates of the regular migrants, which will start after the war. And this has the most important demographic implication now, well beyond the assumption that we have on fertility and mortality, where the trends are clearer, there are less uncertainties. Everything will depend on what we put in terms of scenarios for migration.
Great. Thank you so much for bringing in this very sort of actual topic, the most recent topic when we talk about demography. Can I say thank you to the entire panel for being with us today? I think we had a great discussion. Thank you for your presentations and for your insights. We have to close now due to other commitments by our listeners. You will know that it's a committee and a political group week here in Brussels in the European Parliament, so people will be going on to their committee meetings and other meetings now at 3 p.m. A warm thank you for having been with us today. Follow us on social media. EPRS, epthinktank.eu is our website. And for those of you who were interested in some of the works and studies cited, our panelists also put the links into the chat function, so you find it at the bottom right corner, the links to some of the publications by the OECD and the GARC, for example. Thank you for being with us and have a good day. Bye.
Bye.